An apology from the chair of the embattled local police board. St. Joe's officials still hoping for more detox bed funding. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addresses U.S. Congress. Good evening and thank you for joining us. The chair of the embattled Thunder Bay Police Services Board held a news conference today. She made her first comments on the reinvestigation of 16 Indigenous deaths in the city.
Kristen Oliver apologized to the affected families, and she insists the board is trying to rebuild trust in the local police service. Vasilios Bellos reports.
Chair Kristen Oliver's remarks come as there are ongoing reinvestigations into 16 cases involving Indigenous deaths in Thunder Bay. Thunder Bay Police Service is also facing complaints against senior leadership regarding discrimination and mental health of workers. Chair Oliver addressed the turmoil, remaining optimistic that trust between the community and police service can be rebuilt.
I think that with concrete policies and plans in place that demonstrate clearly to Indigenous communities, their leadership, and to their community and to the people within their community, that we are taking this seriously. I think that when you look at the recommendations and the substantial work that's already been completed, I think that's an indication there as well that we're taking these recommendations seriously and trying to rebuild that trust.
Last week, the board agreed to bring on an expert panel to review human rights complaints and mental health concerns surrounding Thunder Bay policing, further adding to those with the service under their microscope. Chair Oliver offered apologies to the families, stating that the extensive ongoing review forces them to relive tragedy.
I certainly feel for these families. They've been through a lot, and I know that the chief also stated the same thing. When we look at the reinvestigations and the outcomes of these investigations, I think that these families have been, they continue to feel grief and sorrow because the closure just isn't there. And for that, I sincerely apologize.
Oliver's apology comes as some First Nations leaders in the north, including Anishinaabe-Aski Nation Deputy Grand Chief, have called for the disbandment of the Thunder Bay Police Service. Vasilios Bellos, TBT News.
A second arrest has been made in connection with a shooting in the Intercity area last Tuesday that culminated in an armed standoff with the OPP near Hercote. Thunder Bay police were originally dispatched to a home on Forest Street where a male victim was found with non-life-threatening gunshot wounds. 34-year-old Andrew Plummer of Brampton was arrested later that day for attempted murder after exchanging gunfire with police on Highway 1117. Today, Thunder Bay police announced that a 25-year-old Toronto woman has now been charged with accessory after the fact. She's been remanded into custody and will appear in court tomorrow.
Officials with St. Joseph's Care Group remain optimistic that the recent provincial funding for addictions treatment beds won't take them out of the running for the larger crisis center that they've been asking for. In the meantime, the 34 new beds announced by the province this week will help and could help lay the groundwork for additional funding. Corey Nordstrom has more.
Monday's announcement sees $1.1 million going to a coalition of agencies, including St. Joseph's Care Group. It means at least 6 more addiction treatment beds for St. Joe's and helps expand services at places such as the Balmoral Centre. For years, the city and local agencies have requested a new 24/7, 40-bed crisis center. St. Joseph's Care Group Vice President of Addictions and Mental Health, Nancy Black, explains that this week's funding is not a substitution for that proposal.
Anything is possible. I mean, there may be opportunities to consolidate services into one location, for example, so I don't think anything's off the table. But again, this will provide us with at least a good opportunity to demonstrate the need in a very fulsome, measured way that we'll be reporting back to our funders and to Ontario Health and the ministry so that they know exactly what we need within this particular neck of the woods.
While Black has stated that the crisis center would address many issues in the city, she recognized how much of an impact this week's funding will have.
Every single new bed in the system is sorely needed. It's a sad reality, but the needs in this region are significant, and the needs in the city of Thunder Bay and district alone are significant.
Mayor Bill Morrow has repeatedly gone to bat for the project while speaking with provincial ministers and says these groups are still able to push for more support even after this week's funding.
So that network of agencies, individually or collectively, will still be in a position to advocate on parts of the proposal that they feel are still necessary to help meet the demand in the city and in the district.
Many groups advocating for the crisis center have said it would lead to savings in other areas for the city by reducing demand on emergency services such as police and EMS. Corey Nordstrom, TBC News.
Turning to COVID-19 now, cases at the Regional Health Sciences Center increased slightly today, but the number of ICU patients has gone down. There are now 24 COVID patients being treated at the regional hospital, up from 22 on Tuesday. The number of those patients in intensive care has dipped from 7 to 6. The hospital's occupancy rate is now just under 104%, while the occupancy rate in the ICU has fallen below 73%. The Thunder Bay District Health Unit is reporting 77 new COVID cases since Monday. There are now 163 active cases. That's an increase of 7. Last week's COVID-19 incidence rate fell to 193 cases per 100,000 people, down from nearly 215 cases the week before. And the latest test positivity rate is down to 19.7%, 4/10 lower than before. Cases have increased in the Northwestern Health Unit, rising from 138 on Monday to 196. 153 of those cases, or 78% of the total, come from the Sioux Lookout Health Hub. The 7-day test positivity rate has slipped to 17.6%. Kenora MP Eric Melillo says he's proud to be one of the 313 Canadians who've been blacklisted by the Russian government and barred from entering that country. The ban includes many other parliamentarians who have spoken out against the invasion in Ukraine. The ban came the same day that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed Canada's parliament asking for more support to counter the Russian invasion. The Kenora MP is the lone member from Northwestern Ontario on the list. That also includes the Prime Minister and others. Melillo says the ban doesn't faze him at all, as he has absolutely no desire to travel to Russia.
I do see this as a badge of honor because I'm proud to stand with Ukraine and with the Ukrainian people, alongside all parliamentarians, and I think it's great to see that we're united there. And I know that these sanctions aren't going to deter us from continuing to stand up for what's right.
Nearly all of the Conservative Party was sanctioned. 116 of the 159 Liberal MPs also made the list, as did some high-ranking members of other parties. Melillo says all parties agree that more needs to be done to help Ukraine.
The province and Ottawa are investing in a shift to green technology in Ontario's auto manufacturing industry. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Premier Doug Ford made the announcement this morning. Colin DeMillo has a story.
It is a significant shift propelled by two levels of government. The Honda manufacturing plant in Alliston is getting a $1.3 billion electric overhaul, including $250 million from taxpayers.
These investments will ensure Honda Canada builds its next generation models like hybrids right here in Ontario to be sold right across North America.
Over the past 2 years, the Ford government has been throttling up spending related to electric vehicles, responding to growing consumer demand and the manufacturing jobs that come along with it.
More and more people will look at alternative mobility and alternative technologies. That's what we're seeing when we ask our members in various studies that we do.
But while the government has been courting EV manufacturing, it's done little to incentivize people to actually buy the product. Ontario currently doesn't offer a rebate to make the switch, and the Premier suggests the province doesn't need one.
Since we've been in office, electric vehicles have tripled in sales.
Sales have indeed been rising without the rebates, but electric vehicles and hybrids made up just 8% of total sales in 2021. And the issue will likely come up during the election because other parties have pledged to revive the rebate.
We need to have, for now, a temporary purchase incentive. This year, there'd be about a $10,000 incentive for a pure electric car, not a hybrid, of $5,000 for the hybrids that have longer range.
And what about charging stations, which are seen as key to incentivizing drivers?
Range has been one of the biggest factors, how far they can drive between having to charge their electric vehicle. And part of that is also the infrastructure to be able to charge your vehicle conveniently, depending on where you are.
The Premier offered a tepid response.
As the market demands it, they'll continue putting the chargers throughout Ontario.
Meanwhile, other political parties are offering rebates for home EV charging stations, hoping to drive up demand and voter support.
Wyloo Metals is now officially the owner of Noront Resources, meaning the Australian company now owns the largest stake in the Ring of Fire. The acquisition came with a $616 million price tag. Nearly 99% of Noront shareholders voted in favor of the deal during a special meeting on Tuesday. The shareholders now still have 10 days to decide if they want to retain their shares or receive a cash offer from Wyloo. The sale includes the high-grade Eagle's Nest deposit, which has high amounts of nickel, copper, platinum, and palladium. Noront Resources expects the takeover by Wyloo Metals will be approved by the Ontario Superior Court of Justice in early April.
The City of Thunder Bay has announced that due to the warm weather, its outdoor rinks have closed for the year. The only exception will be the ice sheet at Prince Arthur's Landing that will remain open until Sunday evening. Impacts of Russian invasion of Ukraine are wide-reaching, and it may impact on the local shipping season, but it's still too early to say exactly how. Port of Thunder Bay CEO Tim Heaney says potash shipments are likely to increase, given that Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus are all major exporters of the substance, which is used in fertilizer. Grain exports, on the other hand, are dependent on the growing season and may not see a shift until the next harvest.
Was built to service Europe, the trading between Canada and Europe. So when those markets change, of course, you'll see some impacts on the Seaway. So it's too early to determine what that'll be in its entirety, though.
Thunder Bay is the only load point on the Great Lakes for the potash, which is loaded at 2 terminals here. Heaney expects to see an increase in work hours and shipping traffic at those terminals.
Well, Fiona, another warm one today. We heard about many of the local rinks closing, and it's no wonder. I'm sure that rain that we saw during the day did a number on them.
The rain and the lack of below freezing temperatures last night. In fact, temperatures really have not moved much at all in nearly 24 hours. A low of 1, a high of 3. That's a 2-degree difference. So that rain had no chance really of freezing throughout the day today. That's despite winds from the northeast 9 to 15 kilometers per hour. Now, if we take a look at what's been going on across the region, there is sunshine to the west at this hour in Fort Frances. They started off with a lot of cloud, but they also started off above the freezing mark as well with a low of 2. So they're enjoying this 12 Celsius right now. A little cooler as you head into Kenora at 9, 10 in Dryden. A fair bit cooler in Red Lake at this hour, but still 4 Celsius, 4 degrees above the freezing mark, and that's after an overnight low of -4. So they did have some snow first thing this morning, but for the most part, it's been rain throughout the day. Sioux Lookout currently at 6.3 in Armstrong. Greenstone stayed below the freezing mark for most of the day until about the last hour, hour and a half. So they've been dealing with light snow until about 4 o'clock this afternoon. They had a little bit of rain. There's still a chance for it tonight, but right now cloudy skies at 1.5 in Marathon. Sault Ste. Marie also hit below the freezing mark with a low of -4, but topped out with a high of 9 a couple of hours ago. It's now starting to cool off under cloudy skies. They're at 6 Celsius. Here in the city of Thunder Bay, we are expecting to slip just below the freezing mark, but I don't think it's going to be enough with all the heat that has amassed close to the ground to cause a whole lot of freezing. And we've got the showers starting to taper off. May have a passing shower or two over the next hour or so, but then it's going to taper off. So we drop down to that -1. But as we head into tomorrow, well, we've got a lot of mild Pacific air pushing up from the south. It's going to continue to keep things very mild. In fact, this week is expected to be on average the warmest week of the month. Although don't expect any extreme cold for the second half of March. I'll have more details later on in the news hour.
Thank you so much, Fiona. Well, we now know that Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, announced and did a very emotional speech to the Canadian Parliament. But he also reached out to the U.S. Congress and within another emotional speech. And we'll tell you what he had to say after the break.
The Ukrainian people are defending not only Ukraine. We are fighting for the values of Europe and the world.
A day after addressing the Canadian Parliament and asking lawmakers for help imposing a no-fly zone over his country, Ukraine's president delivered yet another emotional speech with similar demands to the U.S. Congress.
His speech comes as officials from Ukraine and Russia offered cautious optimism that peace talks are starting to show signs of progress. Annie Bergeron-Oliver has the latest from Ottawa.
The president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky.
Another speech, another desperate plea for help.
Росія атакувала не просто нас.
Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky telling Congress Russia has turned Ukraine's skies into a source of death. He drove that message home with this video showing civilians at peace in their cities, then their homes destroyed by Russian missiles. Unlike his address to the Canadian Parliament, Zelensky finished his speech in English.
Today, the Ukrainian people are defending not only Ukraine, we are fighting for the values of Europe and the world, sacrificing our lives in the name of the future.
The war's death toll mounting by the hour. Russian forces reportedly shot and killed 10 civilians who were standing in line for bread. In the eastern city of Kharkiv, an airstrike leveled a residential neighborhood. To help protect his people, Zelensky once again pled for a no-fly zone, something U.S. President Joe Biden and Western allies have rejected. Despite that, today Biden announced an additional $800 million worth of new security assistance and military equipment for Ukraine.
These are atrocities. They're an outrage to the world. And the world is united in our support for Ukraine and our determination to make Putin pay a very heavy price.
Canada has given Ukraine a total of $33 million in military aid, and the Prime Minister was pressed as to why that number isn't higher.
The challenging supply lines getting things into Ukraine are an issue that all of NATO is facing right now, but we're going to continue to be there with as much help as we can possibly give.
The Prime Minister will join the U.S. President and other world leaders at a special NATO summit in Brussels next week, marking the second time Trudeau will be in Europe in a month. Annie Bergeron-Oliver, CTV News, Ottawa.
NATO defense ministers met in Brussels today to discuss the war in Ukraine and how the alliance is adapting to the security threat posed by Russia. Defense Minister Anita Anand and her counterparts agreed to continue sending weapons to Ukraine, even as they become targets of Russian sanctions. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg told the ministers to draw up plans for new ways to deter Russia, including beefing up troops on NATO's eastern flank. But despite countless pleas from Ukraine's president, Stoltenberg says the alliance is in agreement. A no-fly zone is out of the question.
We have a responsibility to ensure that this conflict, this war, doesn't escalate beyond Ukraine. We see death, we see destruction, we see human suffering in Ukraine, but this can become even worse if NATO took actions that actually turned this into a full-fledged war between NATO and Russia.
Still, that push for a no-fly zone is a priority for a group of Ukrainians who rallied outside the NATO headquarters.
Actually, Ukrainian army is doing very well on the ground, but we cannot make sure that no bombs fall in Ukraine.
The protesters are also calling on NATO to provide fighter jets to Ukraine. It's something that has proven to be a complicated process after the U.S. rejected an offer from Poland, calling it untenable.
The woman who disrupted a live news broadcast on Russian state television says she's extremely concerned about her safety. In her first television interview since being on air, Marina Ovsyannikova told Reuters this morning that she hopes her protest against the war was not in vain. She added she has no plan to flee Russia. Ovsyannikova was released from custody yesterday. She told reporters she wasn't allowed to sleep and was interrogated for 14 hours. She was fined about $345 and could face more serious charges.
Well, the Ukrainian refugee crisis has reached a staggering milestone. More than 3 million people have now fled the country after just 3 weeks of war. The United Nations Refugee Agency says more than 1.8 million people have gone to Poland, increasing that country's total population by nearly 5%. The EU estimates the cost of supporting the refugees could be upwards of 50 billion euros this year alone. Jay Gray reports from near the Polish-Ukrainian border.
The suburbs in ruins, Russian troops now pushing to the edge of Kyiv, their missiles inside. This strike taking down high-rise apartments in the capital city. Mayor Vitaly Klitschko instituting a curfew and urging those who aren't fighting to take cover.
I call to everyone, every civilian, please spend the time, if it's possible, in bunkers.
As so many in other areas rush to escape, 29-year-old Ulya Litkovich leaving most everything she owns and her dreams behind.
Sorry. I love my city. It's very beautiful. We want to live the whole life there.
More than 3 million, mostly women and children, have left Ukraine. Victoria Banash wishes she could go back in. Her mom and grandparents trapped in their small village right now with no way out.
My heart is broken. We just, pray and trust God that they will be okay. They can't leave now.
Banash moved to the U.S. 6 years ago, but couldn't stay away as the fighting started in her homeland.
Today we had a lot of little toys for kids, coloring books and, crayons, and we brought some medicine. But we can't sit home, we had to be here. So now we're here and we try to do our best to help Ukrainian people.
Help so desperately needed by so many right now. Jay Gray, NBC News, along the Poland-Ukraine border.
Well, shifting to COVID-19 now, the World Health Organization is warning that a recent spike in cases could signal a much bigger problem.
These increases are occurring despite reductions in testing in some countries, which means the cases we're seeing are just the tip of the iceberg.
The UN Health Agency says new infections jumped by 8% around the world last week. It's the first increase since the end of January. The biggest increase was in the Western Pacific, where cases rose by 25% and deaths rose by 27%.
To the U.S. now, where Pfizer is petitioning the FDA for authorization of a second booster dose for seniors. Rena Roy has that story.
Pfizer is calling for a fourth COVID shot in people 65 and older, saying it dramatically improves protection. The drug maker requesting emergency use authorization from the FDA, which will look at data to determine if and when the additional shot is needed.
I'm a big proponent of second boosters or fourth shots. If you still want to protect against infection and long COVID, I think we may need that booster.
58 million Americans who are eligible to receive the vaccine still have yet to get their first dose. This as concerns grow about another potential wave of COVID. The CDC reporting more than 1/3 of its wastewater sampling sites have seen a spike in the virus in the last 2 weeks.
What we know is that wastewater data tends to precede infection case identification that we tend to see when people go get tested. And we are seeing an increase in wastewater data.
Health officials keeping a close eye on a subvariant of Omicron, BA2, which appears to be 30% more transmissible than Omicron and makes up for nearly a quarter of new cases in the U.S. While the percentage of BA2 cases are up, the total number of new COVID cases in the country is down, most of the country easing restrictions.
I don't think we're lifting them too soon, but I think that if people are taking that as a sign that the pandemic is over, they are going to be sorely disappointed. This pandemic continues, and it's critical we pay attention to public health guidance.
And the pandemic's still taking its toll on the U.S. economy. Women left the workforce early on in the pandemic at greater rates than men, and they have been more reluctant to return. Last month, there were still nearly 1.5 million fewer employed women compared to 500,000 fewer men. Rena Roy, ABC News, New York.
Well, back in this country, some potentially good news for those looking to do some traveling. The federal government is reportedly set to ease pandemic travel rules by lifting the requirement for some to take a pre-arrival COVID-19 test before crossing the border. The announcement is reportedly coming tomorrow and will apply